I never imagined my own sister would turn into the kind of person I'd fear opening my front door to. But that night, when I heard the pounding on the glass and the shattering that followed, I realized just how far she was willing to go. My own blood, my sister, broke into my home with two of her friends, carrying baseball bats, screaming that I owed her my house, my money, and my silence. It all started when she racked up $150,000 in debt, a mess she created with reckless spending and bad decisions. She had begged me to sell my house and cover it, but I refused. That house wasn't just bricks and wood. It was my late parents' gift, the place I had poured my life into. I thought she would be angry, maybe even stop talking to me. I never thought she'd planned something so violent, so cruel, so unrecognizable. I can still remember the sound of splintering wood as the front door gave way, the echo of boots on the floor, and her voice, raspy, furious, filled with betrayal, demanding what she thought she was entitled to. My heart raced as I realized I wasn't facing a family dispute anymore. I was fighting for my safety, for my dignity, and for the home that carried every memory of love I had left. What happened that night ripped open the fragile bond we had as siblings and replaced it with something darker. Fear, betrayal, and a pain that no amount of apologies could heal. This wasn't just about money. This was about control, respect, and survival. And as the police sirens grew louder in the distance, I realized this night would change our family forever. The day my sister came to me with her request, I didn't know that it would be the spark that would ignite the most terrifying chapter of my life. To me, she was still my sister. Flawed, reckless, sometimes selfish, but still the person I had grown up sharing a bedroom with, the one who used to sneak cookies under the blanket and whisper stories to me late into the night when we were kids. That history was heavy enough to make me listen when she knocked on my door one Sunday morning. Her hair messy, her eyes tired, and her voice trembling. She asked me for something outrageous, to sell my house and use the money to cover her debt. At first I laughed because the idea was absurd, and it seemed like the sort of dramatic request she might make as a joke. But the way she stood there, clutching her purse as though it was her lifeline, told me there was nothing funny about it. My house wasn't just a property to me. It was the one solid thing I had left from our parents, who had passed away years ago. They had left me the house, not her, not because they loved me more, but because I was the one who took care of them in their last years. I was the one who stayed behind, while she chased adventures and made choices that pulled her further and further into trouble. The house wasn't just four walls. It was the smell of my mother's cooking that still lingered in the kitchen, the faded dent in the living room floor where Dad's favorite chair used to sit, the small scratch on the wall where we had marked our heights as children. It was memory, security, and love. To imagine selling it was like imagining selling my childhood, my parents, and everything I had worked for. She, however, saw it differently. She didn't see the house as a place of memories, but as a golden ticket. You could sell it for $300,000 easily, she said, her eyes wide and desperate, her hands flying through the air as she painted the picture. You'd have enough to clear my debt, and you'd still have plenty left over. You don't even need all this space anyway. It's too big for you. Her words cut deeper than she realized. Too big. It was exactly the size of my life, of my grief, of everything I was holding together. I shook my head and told her no. Firmly. I thought that would be the end of it. But that was only the beginning. In the days that followed, she came back again and again, each time with a different tactic. One day she tried tears, sitting on my porch steps with her head in her hands, sobbing loudly enough that the neighbors peeked out their windows. "You're my only hope," she cried, her voice hoarse. "I'll die if you don't help me." Another day she came with anger, her voice sharp, her body tense as she pointed her finger at me. "You're selfish. You have everything and I have nothing. If you don't help me, I swear you'll regret it." I tried to reason with her, to explain that her problems weren't mine to solve, that she had made choices and she needed to face them. But reasoning with someone drowning in desperation is like throwing water at someone already sinking. She couldn't hear me. She only heard the word no, and every time I said it, I saw her eyes darken a little more. The debt she owed was no small matter. It wasn't a credit card balance or a car loan. It was gambling, risky investments, reckless spending on luxuries she couldn't afford. I knew she had always lived beyond her means, but I hadn't realized how deep she had gone until she spelled it out in that shaky voice. $150,000. She owed it not just to banks, but to people she shouldn't have gotten involved with. When she admitted that, a cold chill ran down my spine. I understood then why she was so desperate, why she had come to me instead of trying to fix it herself. She wasn't just worried about money. She was afraid for her safety. But even that fear couldn't change my answer. The more she pushed, the more I resisted, because I knew once I gave in, there would be no end to it. If I sold my house today to cover her debt, what would stop her from demanding more tomorrow? And more importantly, what would be left of me once I handed over the only thing that anchored me in this world? I tried to offer her smaller forms of help. I suggested we talk to a lawyer, a financial advisor, even the police if she was in real danger. She rejected all of it. She didn't want advice. She didn't want a plan. She wanted cash, quick, and she was convinced I was the answer. The tension between us grew thicker each day. The phone calls became relentless, sometimes late at night, sometimes at dawn, as though she wanted to wear me down by sheer persistence. My voicemail was filled with her pleading, her yelling, her guilt-tripping. Friends told me to block her number, to cut her off completely, but she was my sister. How could I block family? Even in my anger, even in my frustration, I remembered the little girl who used to curl up next to me when she was scared of thunderstorms. I couldn't shut the door on her completely. Still, I didn't realize how far she was willing to go until that one afternoon when I came home from work to find her car parked crookedly in my driveway. She was sitting inside, staring at the house with a look I couldn't quite read. Part envy, part bitterness, part calculation. When I approached, she rolled down the window and said in a low, almost menacing tone, "If you don't help me soon, I'll have no choice. I'll do whatever it takes." The words chilled me because they weren't shouted in anger. They were whispered like a promise. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, touching the walls, the pictures, the old furniture, as though reassuring myself it was still mine, still safe. But for the first time I felt the security of my home crack. For the first time, I wondered if the danger wasn't outside with strangers but inside my own family, with a person who should have protected me as much as I protected her. In the days that followed, her visits became less frequent, but her silence was heavier. It wasn't the silence of someone who had given up. It was the silence of someone planning, calculating, waiting. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that she wouldn't really do anything drastic, that at the end of the day, she was still my sister. But somewhere deep down, a voice whispered that the bond we had once shared had already fractured, and the pieces were sharp enough to cut. That was how it all began. Not with bats, not with breaking glass, but with a knock on my door and a request so outrageous it should have been impossible to take seriously. But I took it seriously, and in refusing her, I set in motion a storm I couldn't control. And though I didn't know it then, I had just stepped into the first chapter of the nightmarish story that would change everything I believed about family, trust, and the lengths desperation can drive a person to. The weeks that followed our last heated exchange were some of the most unsettling of my life. At first, I thought perhaps my sister had finally given up on her wild demand. She stopped knocking on my door every morning, and her voice disappeared from my voicemail for a time. For a brief moment, I let myself breathe, believing that maybe she had come to her senses or found another way to fix her mess. But peace in my life had become an illusion, a fragile glass waiting for the slightest pressure to shatter. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought comfort. It was the silence of a storm gathering, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash its fury. The first signs of her new approach came in whispers through mutual acquaintances. A friend of mine mentioned running into her at the grocery store, where she spoke loudly enough for others to hear about how heartless I was, how I was letting her drown while I sat comfortably in my big fancy house. She painted me as greedy, selfish, and cruel. The story she spun was almost admirable in its creativity. She told people that I had inherited far more than the house, that I was sitting on secret savings, that I could have helped her 10 times over but refused out of spite. Each retelling, each rumor, seemed to add another layer of venom, designed to turn others against me. Soon, people who once greeted me warmly at the coffee shop began to avoid my eyes. Neighbors who used to smile when I watered the lawn started looking at me with quiet judgment. I realized then that her campaign against me had gone beyond our family. She was now rewriting me into the villain of her tragedy. I wanted to confront her, to demand why she was dragging my name through the mud. But I resisted. I thought ignoring her slander would weaken its effect, that if I refused to dignify it with attention, it would fade. But I underestimated the power of lies repeated often enough. One evening, as I sat down to dinner alone, I received a message from an old family friend, a woman who had known us since childhood. Her words were sharp and dripping with disappointment. "How could you turn your back on your own sister when she's in danger? Your parents would be ashamed." My chest tightened as I read it. That was the moment I understood just how deeply my sister's poison was spreading. At home, I found myself glancing out the window more often, scanning the driveway for her car. Even when she wasn't there, I felt her presence looming, as though her anger had seeped into the walls. At night, the house didn't feel as safe as it once had. The shadows seemed darker, the creaks in the floorboards louder. My mind, restless and wary, played tricks on me. Once I thought I heard someone rattling the back door, but when I checked, no one was there. Another time, I woke in the middle of the night to find the porch light smashed, glass scattered across the steps. I wanted to believe it was the wind or a careless passerby, but deep inside, I knew it was her. It had her signature all over it. Silent, menacing, a warning. Her tactics escalated soon after. One afternoon, I returned from work to find an envelope shoved under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 words written in her unmistakable handwriting. "You owe me this much." There was no signature, no explanation, but taped to the page was a photograph of our parents' old family portrait, the one that had always hung in the hallway when we were children. The picture had been cut in half, with her side taped neatly next to the note and mine shredded into pieces. I stood there in the kitchen, the torn fragments of my face staring up from the counter, and felt my stomach twist into knots. That was no longer the plea of a desperate sibling. It was the threat of someone who had crossed a line I never thought she'd approach. The worst part wasn't the note itself. It was the way it made me doubt everything I thought I knew about her. I replayed memories of us as children, searching for signs of this darkness, wondering if it had always been there, hidden beneath laughter and shared secrets. Had I missed something? Or had desperation truly transformed her into someone unrecognizable? These questions haunted me as much as the note. When I finally confronted her over the phone, my voice shaking with anger, she laughed. A short, sharp, bitter laugh that didn't sound like her at all. "You think you can ignore me forever?" she said coldly. "You think you can hide in that house and pretend it's yours alone? You're wrong. That house should be mine too. Mom and Dad would never want you hoarding it while I suffer. You're going to regret this." Her words were delivered with such venom that I felt my hands tremble. For the first time, I realized she no longer saw me as her brother but as an enemy, an obstacle standing between her and survival. My friends, the few who still stood by me, urged me to take precautions. "Change the locks," one said. "Get cameras," another advised. I did both, but neither eased the gnawing anxiety inside me. Security systems could only do so much when the threat came from someone who knew me so well, someone who understood my habits, my fears, and even the creaks in the floorboards of the house we once ran through together as children. The pressure of it all began to wear me down. My sleep grew restless, my appetite vanished, and every knock at the door sent a jolt of fear through me. I started avoiding the rooms with windows facing the street, convinced she might be watching from her car. Every time the phone rang, I hesitated before answering, afraid it would be her voice on the other end, dripping with demands and threats. My house, once a sanctuary, was becoming a prison of paranoia. Then came the incident that stripped away any remaining illusion of safety. It was late one evening, the rain pounding hard against the roof, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. My heart raced as I froze, listening. The footsteps didn't move toward the door. They lingered, pacing slowly as though the person outside was savoring the moment. Gathering my courage, I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek. In the dim glow of the streetlight, I saw her standing there, soaked by the rain, her hair plastered to her face, a baseball bat in her hand. She wasn't moving toward the door, but the look in her eyes as she stared at the house was enough to send a shiver through me. She stayed for several minutes, motionless except for the slow grip and release of her hands on the bat's handle, and then she walked away into the darkness. I couldn't sleep that night. The image of her standing in the rain burned into my mind, her silence more terrifying than any of her words. It was no longer a question of if she would act but when. And with that realization came another truth I could no longer ignore. The sister I once loved was gone, and in her place stood someone who saw me not as family but as prey. The night it finally happened was colder than most, though it wasn't winter. A sharp wind rattled the windows and carried a low, constant whistle through the trees outside. I had tried to distract myself with a book, though my eyes skimmed the same paragraph over and over without registering a single word. The unease in my stomach had been growing for days, gnawing at me like hunger I couldn't satisfy. The memory of her standing outside in the rain with a bat haunted me so much that every creak of the house now felt like a warning. I had locked every door, double-checked every window, and yet there was no peace. I kept the lights on longer than usual, leaving the porch light glowing like a feeble attempt at protection, though part of me knew it wouldn't stop her if she decided tonight was the night. Started just past midnight. A sudden, violent pounding on the front door jolted me upright. The sound reverberated through the walls, so forceful it felt like the door itself might buckle. My chest tightened as my breath caught, and I froze in my chair, gripping the book as though it were a shield. The pounding continued. 3, 4, 5 brutal bangs, and then came the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. My heart leapt into my throat. She wasn't just knocking anymore. She was coming in. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaky hands as I backed toward the kitchen. Before the operator could finish her greeting, I heard the door splinter, wood cracking like bones, and the heavy thud of boots crossing the threshold. My sister's voice filled the house, ragged and furious, echoing through the hallways like a demon unleashed. "Where are you?" she screamed. "You owe me. This house is mine too." The operator's voice in my ear told me to stay calm, to stay hidden if possible, but calm was no longer within my reach. My pulse hammered so loud it drowned out her words. I crouched behind the kitchen island, whispering my address into the phone, every syllable trembling. The sound of footsteps multiplied, heavier now, joined by the mocking laughter of 2 men. She hadn't come alone. The realization made my stomach twist. She had brought backup, her so-called friends, shadows that had always lingered on the edge of her life, men with nothing to lose. The first crash came from the living room. A picture frame shattered against the floor, followed by the splintering sound of wood as something heavy smashed against a chair. "Find him!" one of the men yelled. My sister's voice cut through the destruction. "He's hiding. Don't let him think he can get away from this." Their footsteps pounded against the hardwood, drawing closer, each one a drumbeat of dread. I whispered to the operator that they had broken in, that they were destroying everything. She told me officers were on their way, but the minutes stretched like hours. I clutched the phone to my chest and prayed the sound of my breathing wouldn't give me away. But the house was betraying me. Every movement, every creak of the floor beneath their boots, every thud of smashed furniture echoed so loudly it felt like there was no hiding place left. A sudden crash behind me made me flinch. The back door had been kicked open. One of them had circled around. Panic surged through me, and I bolted, my footsteps pounding against the tile as I darted toward the stairs. "He's upstairs," I heard one of the men shout, followed by the wild, guttural laugh of another. My sister's voice followed, shrill and merciless. "Don't let him lock himself in. He doesn't get to hide from me." I stumbled up the stairs 2 at a time, my breath ragged, my hands slick with sweat. The house I had once known so well had transformed into a labyrinth of terror. I reached my bedroom and slammed the door, locking it, though I knew the flimsy wood wouldn't withstand their bats for long. I pressed my back against it, clutching the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. Through the pounding of my heart, I could hear them tearing through the house below. Drawers yanked open, cupboards slammed shut, furniture overturned. Every crash was a dagger in my chest, each one chipping away at the sanctuary I had fought so hard to protect. Then the footsteps came up the stairs. Slow, deliberate, like predators savoring the hunt. They stopped just outside my door, and for a moment silence fell. I could almost hear my sister's breathing through the wood. Then her voice, low and venomous, seeped into the room. "You think you can hide from me? This house should have been mine. You've stolen everything. But tonight I take it back." The first swing of the bat rattled the door on its hinges. I jumped back, my phone slipping from my sweaty hand onto the bed. The second blow splintered the frame, a jagged crack snaking down the middle of the door. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, searching desperately for anything to defend myself with. My eyes landed on the heavy lamp by the nightstand. I grabbed it, the cord snapping from the socket as I raised it in trembling hands. The door shuddered with another blow, wood splinters flying. And then, as if by divine timing, a sound pierced the chaos, the wail of sirens in the distance. My heart surged with desperate hope. The pounding on the door faltered for a moment, hesitation breaking through their frenzy. My sister's voice grew frantic, laced with panic. "Hurry! We don't have much time," she hissed. One final strike landed against the door, splitting it near the handle, but the sirens were closer now, growing louder by the second. I pressed myself against the wall, lamp raised, bracing for them to burst through anyway. But then, like animals caught in a trap, their bravado cracked. I heard scrambling footsteps retreating down the hall, the crash of a window breaking, and the rush of bodies fleeing into the night. My sister's voice was the last to fade, shrieking curses as the sound of her boots pounded against the porch and vanished into the darkness. Moments later, the front door burst open again, not with bats and fury, but with the commanding shouts of officers. Flashlights swept through the halls, cutting through the destruction like beacons. I dropped the lamp from my shaking hands and stumbled forward, barely able to form words as I tried to explain between gasps of breath. They found me trembling in the hallway, my body numb, my voice raw. The house was unrecognizable. Shattered glass littered the floors, furniture lay overturned and broken, and the walls bore fresh scars from bat swings. But none of it hurt as much as the realization that my sister, my own blood, had orchestrated it all. This wasn't some robbery by strangers. This wasn't some accident. It was her. She had chosen to invade my home, to destroy it, to terrify me, all because I had refused to sell the last piece of our parents' legacy. As I sat on the bottom step, wrapped in the officer's blanket, listening to the distant crackle of police radios, a hollow ache spread through my chest. The home that had once been my refuge was now tainted by fear and betrayal. I could fix the broken windows, replace the furniture, scrub the blood of memories off the walls. But I couldn't repair what had been broken between us. That fracture was permanent, jagged, and it cut deeper than any bat ever could. The morning after the break-in, my house no longer felt like a home but a crime scene, hollow and broken, every surface scarred by violence. The officers who had stayed through the night catalogued the damage with clinical efficiency, their flashlights glinting off shattered glass and splintered wood as they collected what little evidence they could. I sat in the corner of the living room, wrapped in a blanket I hadn't bothered to remove, staring at the destruction as though it belonged to someone else's life. The couch was slashed, my father's old cabinet had been smashed into kindling, and pieces of picture frames littered the floor like jagged memories. The house seemed to echo with ghosts now, not of my parents but of my sister's rage, each broken object a reminder of the lengths she had gone. When the officers finally asked me to recount the events once more, my voice cracked under the weight of it. I told them about the bats, the shouting, the men she brought, the threats, and the terror that still clung to me like smoke after a fire. They nodded, their pens scratching, but their eyes carried the same disbelief I still felt. How could a sister do this? It wasn't long before they found her. Less than 12 hours after the invasion, an officer called to tell me she had been arrested a few towns over. Her so-called friends had abandoned her, but the car she used had been spotted, and within hours she was in custody. When I heard the news, relief should have washed over me, but instead I felt something heavier, an ache, a grief so profound it settled deep in my bones. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. Instead, I sat in silence at the kitchen table, staring at the cracks in the plaster, and wondered how the girl I once knew, the sister who used to braid my hair, who used to laugh with me under the stars, who used to cry when she scraped her knees, had become the woman who tried to break me. In the days that followed, the house was repaired piece by piece, but each repair only reminded me of what had been lost. Workers replaced the front door, reinforced the frame, and installed stronger locks. New glass panes were fitted into windows. Fresh paint covered the gouges on the walls, and the porch light was fixed so it could glow once more. Yet no matter how much was mended, the soul of the house felt altered. Every creak at night still made my heart race. Every gust of wind rattling the shutters reminded me of that first thunderous pounding on the door. The house I once considered my sanctuary had become a place of vigilance, where I lived not with peace but with a constant awareness of what had happened. The real torment, though, wasn't the physical damage but the emotional wreckage. News of my sister's arrest spread quickly. Some relatives called me, their voices heavy with disappointment, asking how I could let things go so far, as though I had orchestrated her downfall. They told me family should protect family, that maybe if I had helped her with money, none of this would have happened. Their words cut deep, reopening wounds I thought I had sealed, because no one seemed to understand that helping her wasn't help at all. It would only have fed the fire of her recklessness. Others, however, called to express their quiet relief, admitting they had long feared her spiraling behavior but never expected it would end like this. Their pity felt just as heavy as the accusations, a reminder that my sister was no longer seen as a woman in trouble but as a cautionary tale. The worst call came from our aunt, who had been like a second mother after our parents passed. Her voice trembled with heartbreak as she asked me how things had reached this point. "She's my niece," she whispered through tears. "But she's your sister. You grew up together. How could she do this to you?" Had no answer. I could only sit with the phone pressed to my ear, tears rolling silently down my cheeks, because the truth was I didn't understand it either. I had spent weeks replaying every moment of our childhood, searching for a crack in the bond we once shared, some clue that this darkness had always been hiding inside her. But all I could find were memories of us laughing, of us crying together, of us promising we'd always look out for one another. It was impossible to reconcile those memories with the woman who stood in my house, bat in hand, screaming for what she believed I owed. The police asked if I wanted to press charges, though they assured me the state already had enough to pursue her for breaking and entering, property damage and assault. The decision weighed heavily on me. Pressing charges against strangers would have been simple, but pressing charges against my sister felt like betraying a part of myself. Yet as I thought about the fear she had inflicted, the destruction she had caused, and the unrelenting belief that she was entitled to everything I owned, I realized the betrayal had already happened. It was hers, not mine. With a heavy heart, I told them yes to do whatever was necessary. It felt like sealing a coffin on whatever was left of our relationship, burying the bond we once had under the weight of her choices. The nights were the hardest. Even with her locked away, I couldn't shake the fear. I would wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, convinced I heard her voice calling my name from the hallway. Shadows twisted on the walls, and every flicker of light felt like the swing of a bat. Sleep offered no refuge, only nightmares of her face twisted with rage, of my parents' house splintering into pieces around me while I tried desperately to hold it together. In the quiet hours before dawn, I often sat in the living room, clutching a mug of cold coffee, staring at the patched-up door, and wondering if peace would ever return. When I finally visited her in jail, it wasn't out of forgiveness but out of a desperate need for answers. She sat across from me, wearing the standard orange uniform, her hair tangled, her eyes dull yet still carrying a spark of defiance. I searched her face for the sister I once knew, but all I found was bitterness etched deep into her features. "You did this to me," she spat before I could even speak. If you had just sold the house, none of this would have happened. You ruined my life." Her words slammed into me like a physical blow. Even after everything, even with her freedom stripped away, she couldn't see her own fault. She couldn't see that her choices, her greed, her anger had led her here. I left that day without saying much, but with the crushing certainty that I had truly lost her. The weeks turned into months, and though the legal process crawled along, I learned to live with the quiet. I began to repair not just the house but myself. I started small with simple routines, watering the plants, cooking meals I hadn't bothered with before, inviting a friend over for coffee. Each act was a way of reclaiming the house from the shadows she had cast over it. Slowly, I reminded myself that it was still my home, still my sanctuary, and that no one, not even my sister, could take that from me. Yet no matter how many repairs I made, no matter how many mornings I woke to sunlight streaming through the windows, there was always an emptiness in me, a hollow space where my sister once lived. Family betrayal leaves scars that no court ruling or police report can heal. Changes the way you see the world, the way you trust, the way you remember the past. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the trees, and wonder if there was a moment I could have stopped her descent. Maybe if I had been stricter when we were younger, maybe if I had pushed her toward responsibility, maybe if I had given her just enough money to keep her afloat without destroying myself. But then I remind myself that regret is a trap, that her choices were hers to make, and that love, no matter how fierce, cannot save someone determined to destroy themselves. In the end, Chapter 4 of my life wasn't about the police reports or the courtrooms or even the repairs to my house. It was about learning to live with the truth. That sometimes the people we love most become the people who hurt us most, and no amount of memory or history can change that. My sister was gone long before the night she broke in. That night only made it undeniable. The months that followed stretched into a blur of hearings, meetings with lawyers, and long lonely nights where the silence of the house pressed down heavier than ever before, but each passing day carried me closer to a final reckoning. By the time the trial began, I was exhausted in ways I never thought possible, not just physically but deep in my soul. Sitting in the courtroom, I felt like I had stepped into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. On one side sat my sister, thinner than I remembered, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes still burning with resentment as if she had been wronged rather than the one who had caused the pain. On the other side sat me, clutching my hands together to keep them from trembling, surrounded by strangers who would decide our fate. The charges laid against her were read out: breaking and entering, destruction of property, attempted assault, and each word carved deeper into me, a reminder that this was no longer just a family dispute but a matter of law. As the witnesses spoke, the officers, the neighbors who had seen the commotion, even a forensic expert who explained the damage, my stomach twisted with shame, not because of what I had done but because it had come to this, my sister's name forever attached to violence and crime. When it was my turn, I stood and spoke with as steady a voice as I could manage, telling the court about that night, the terror of bats swinging, the fear in my chest, the devastation in my home, and most painfully, the betrayal in her eyes. I didn't try to paint myself as strong or brave. I told the truth, that I had been scared, heartbroken, and left wondering how my own sister could turn into a stranger before my eyes. I avoided looking at her while I spoke, not because I didn't want to but because every time our eyes met, I felt like I was being pulled back into the storm of guilt and grief. Her defense tried to argue desperation, that she had been under immense pressure with her debts and had acted out of panic rather than cruelty, but no excuse could soften the facts. She hadn't just come to me for help and been turned away. She had come with weapons, with rage, and with a sense of entitlement that no desperation could justify. The jury took less than 2 hours to deliver their verdict. Guilty. The judge's words seemed to echo through the room as he announced her sentence. 3 years in prison, reduced for her lack of prior convictions but firm enough to acknowledge the severity of her actions. As the gavel struck, the finality of it sank in. My sister, my blood, was being led away in handcuffs, and though part of me felt a small flicker of safety, the rest of me felt only a crushing sorrow. I had wanted justice, yes, but watching her disappear through that door felt like watching the last fragile thread of our bond snap for good. The weeks after the sentencing were quiet, almost too quiet, as though the world had finally settled after the chaos. Friends and neighbors stopped by to check in, some offering words of sympathy, others awkwardly avoiding the topic altogether, but the truth was no one really knew what to say. How could they? There aren't words for when your own sibling tries to destroy you. I busied myself with work, with repairing the last broken corners of the house, with routines that gave me a sense of normalcy. Slowly, the nightmares faded. The shadows in the hall no longer looked like intruders, the creaks in the walls no longer made my heart stop, and for the first time in months, I could sleep without waking in panic. Yet the emptiness never fully left. Every holiday felt incomplete, every family gathering quieter, every mention of her name like pressing on a bruise that hadn't healed. I wrote her letters at first, pouring out my confusion, my anger, my sadness, but I never sent them. What could I say that wouldn't sound like blame? And what could she say that would undo the night she brought bats into my home? Eventually I stopped writing. As time passed, I found myself reflecting more on the idea of family itself. People like to say blood is thicker than water, that family is forever, but I had learned the hardest truth. That family isn't about blood, it's about loyalty, respect, and love. When those things are gone, blood alone can't hold anything together. My sister and I shared a childhood, a history filled with laughter and dreams, but somewhere along the way, she had chosen a different path. And though it tore me apart to admit it, love couldn't save her. I had spent months wondering if I had failed her somehow, if I should have given her the money or found another way to ease her burdens, but deep down, I knew nothing I could have done would have changed the course she set herself on. People must choose their own way, and she had chosen hers, no matter how much it cost. The house, my parents' house, became my anchor. I poured myself into it, not just fixing what was broken but making it truly my own. I planted a small garden in the back, something my mother always wanted but never had time for, and in the evenings I would sit among the flowers and feel a quiet kind of peace. Inside I hung new pictures, not of the past but of the present. Moments with friends, snapshots of small adventures, reminders that life was still moving forward. Every nail hammered, every brush of paint, every bloom that opened in the garden felt like an act of healing, a way of reclaiming what my sister had tried to take. The house no longer felt haunted by that night but alive again, a symbol not of pain but of survival. When her first year in prison passed, I received a letter from her. My hands shook as I opened it, unsure if I wanted to read what she had to say. The words were messy, hurried, and full of anger. She blamed me still, said I had abandoned her, that I had chosen money and walls over family. She said she would never forgive me. I read it once, then tucked it away in a drawer. For days I carried the sting of her words, but eventually I realized something important. Her inability to see the truth was no longer my burden to carry. I couldn't force her to change, and I couldn't carry the weight of her choices forever. That was the moment I let go, not of the love I once had for her, because some part of me would always love the sister she used to be, but of the hope that she would ever return to that person. Letting go was painful, but it was freeing too. Years from now, when people ask me why I live in this old house, why I never sold it, I know I'll smile and say because it's mine, because it holds my history, because it survived. What I won't say is that it also holds the story of a betrayal so deep it nearly broke me, or that its walls have absorbed both laughter and screams. That part is mine alone to carry. But as I sit on the porch in the evenings, the sun painting the sky with gold and crimson, I no longer feel fear or sorrow, feel strength, feel peace. And I know with every fiber of my being that keeping this house was the right choice, not because it made me rich or secure but because it kept me grounded when everything else was torn apart. In the end, my sister's story became a tragedy, one of greed and desperation, of bonds shattered beyond repair. But my story, though scarred, is one of survival. I chose not to let her destroy me, not to let her tear away the last piece of home I had. And while I will always carry the ache of her betrayal, I will also carry the knowledge that I stood firm, that I held on, and that I endured. Some endings are not happy, but they can still bring peace. And as I close this chapter of my life, I know the truth at last. Sometimes letting go of someone you love is the only way to save yourself. Belle, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe to Twisted Fate Chronicle for more powerful and shocking stories every week.